The night I finally stopped being invisible, I was wearing a blazer I'd bought on clearance at Macy's for $42. I remember that detail because my sister had mocked it at Thanksgiving the year before. "That's what you're wearing to dinner? You look like you work at the DMV?" Everyone had laughed, including my mother. I laughed too, because that's what I'd always done. Laughed it off, shrunk a little smaller, passed the rolls and pretended it didn't land. But that night, standing in the lobby of the Harrington Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago, watching the elevator numbers tick down toward me, I smoothed the front of that $42 blazer and thought, good enough. More than good enough. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without the before. I'm the younger of 2 daughters. My sister Diane is 4 years older and has always been, in my family's language, the successful one. She got her MBA from Northwestern at 26. She married a real estate developer named Greg, who my father refers to as a self-made man, which is rich coming from someone who inherited his first business from our grandfather. She drives a white Range Rover. She has a kitchen with a waterfall island and a wine fridge that holds more bottles than I've drunk in my entire life. I became a social worker. Specifically, I got my MSW from the University of Illinois at Chicago and took a job as a child welfare case manager with the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, the agency people make jokes about until they need it. My father, I'll call him Dad because that's what I'd always called him, even when the word stopped feeling like it fit, never said anything directly when I told him. He just looked at me the way you look at a car that won't start. A kind of exhausted disappointment, like he'd already mentally moved on to calling a tow truck. "Social work," he said. "Not a question. Child welfare specifically. I'll be. So government work. Yes, I'll be working with families in crisis. Kids in, it's not a lot of money, that field." "No," I said. "It's not." He nodded slowly. "Well," and that was it. That was the whole conversation. Well, like he was closing a file. What he said to other people was worse because I wasn't supposed to hear it. At his company's annual holiday party when I was 28, I overheard him telling one of his colleagues that his younger daughter works for the state. The colleague asked what I did. My father paused just long enough to be deliberate about it, then said, "She goes into people's homes and checks on them. Kind of like an inspector, I guess." An inspector. I had spent the previous month working a case involving a 7-year-old girl who'd been found alone in an apartment for 4 days with no food and a broken front door. I had been the one to sit on the floor of the hospital room with her while she ate a bowl of mac and cheese and told me about her fish named Bubbles, who she hoped was still okay. I had been the one to coordinate her emergency placement, her therapy referral, her school transfer, and the court documentation that eventually terminated her mother's parental rights. An inspector. I didn't confront him about it. I never did, back then. I drove home that night and cried in the parking garage of my apartment building, which is a thing I did more times than I want to admit. Sat in my car in a parking structure and cried because the weight of my job and the weight of my family's contempt had pressed together into something I couldn't carry inside yet. My mother wasn't cruel about it exactly. She was more of a mirror. Whatever my father reflected, she reflected back a little softer. She'd say things like, "Your father just wants security for you, and Diane's life has turned out so well, don't you think?" As if those two sentences were connected, which they were, just not in the way she meant them to be. Diane was more direct. She didn't hide it as much as my father did. "You know you're never going to be able to buy a house in this city on a DCFS salary," she told me once. Sitting at my mother's kitchen table like she was delivering a quarterly earnings report, "Greg says even the condos in Pilsen are. I'm not really thinking about buying right now." "Right, well, that's the thing." She stirred her coffee. "You should be. You're 31. I know how old I am. I'm just saying. You made choices, and choices have consequences. You made choices, had consequences. You made choices." As if choosing to protect children from abuse was a lifestyle error, like buying too many houseplants or not maxing out your 401k early enough. I didn't fight back. I don't know exactly why. Some combination of exhaustion and a belief, buried so deep I couldn't even see its roots. That maybe they were right. That maybe I had made bad choices. That maybe the fact that my work mattered didn't mean it counted. Not in the way that mattered to them. I just kept going to work, kept sitting on the floors of hospital rooms, Kept writing reports at 10 o'clock at night and answering my phone on weekends and showing up to court dates that got postponed 3 times in a row, and I kept getting better at it. Here's the thing about child welfare work that nobody outside of it understands. It is, in certain configurations, a tremendous amount of institutional power. Not power the way my father understood power. Not Round Rovers and Waterfall Islands and box seats at Wrigley, but power in the sense that matters when it matters. The power to open a case or close one. To recommend family preservation or pursue removal. To testify in front of a judge and have that testimony shape the next decade of a child's life. And then, when I was 32, I got a different kind of power entirely. I applied almost on a whim for a policy and funding role at the Illinois Children's Trust Fund, which is the state agency that manages federal and state grant allocations for child abuse prevention programs across Illinois. The job was called Senior Program Officer. It paid more, it was office-based, and it meant that instead of managing individual cases, I would be managing the money. Specifically, I would be reviewing grant applications from nonprofits, foundations, and community organizations across the state, and deciding which ones received funding and which ones didn't. I got the job. I did not tell my family for 3 months. Not out of strategy. Not yet. I was just so tired of having my milestones filtered through their disappointment that I wanted to hold this one for a while. Just feel good about it without watching that feeling get deflated. When I did tell them, at Easter dinner my mother said, "Oh, that's nice, honey." My father asked what the salary was, and when I told him, he nodded in that way he had, like he was recalibrating his disappointment to a more appropriate level, and said, "Better. Not congratulations. Not I'm proud of you. Better." Diane asked if I'd get dental. I laughed, refilled my wine glass, and changed the subject. But something had shifted in me, quiet and tectonic. I was no longer in a position where I needed their approval to survive. I hadn't been for a while, actually. I just kept acting like I was. I stopped doing that slowly, the way you stop doing anything that's been a habit for 32 years. It took time. But then came the gala. My father's company. He runs a regional commercial real estate firm he built after selling the inherited business years ago. Holds a fundraising gala every October for a nonprofit he co-founded called the Meridian Foundation. Meridian nominally supports family and community development in the Chicago metro area, which in practice means it funds some genuinely good programs and also maintains a beautiful office in River North with furniture my father personally selected. The gala is called the Meridian Excellence Gala. It is held at the Harrington Grand. It draws about 250 people, mostly business associates, local politicians, a few Chicago media personalities, donors. It is the evening my father likes most in the entire year because he gets to stand on a stage and be appreciated by a room full of people who think he is extraordinary. I had been to it twice before. Both times I'd sat at a table near the back with my mother and watched my father work the room and felt that specific loneliness of being invisible in a crowd of people who theoretically knew you. This year, I was invited again. My mother had called in September to make sure I was coming. "Your father would love for you to be there," she said, which meant my father had told her to make sure I came, which meant something, though I didn't know what yet. What I didn't know, when I drove to the Harrington that October evening, was that my father had spent the past 2 months in a quiet panic. The Meridian Foundation had applied for a $400,000 multi-year federal pass-through grant through the Illinois Children's Trust Fund. The application was for an after-school and family stabilization program on the South Side. Legitimately good work, as far as I could tell from the application. But the application had problems. Financial irregularities in the last 2 years of audits, overhead ratios that were difficult to justify, and some documentation around board governance that had flagged concerns in our internal review. The grant application was sitting on my desk. I had not, as of that evening, made a final decision. I was still in the review period. My father did not know I worked at the Illinois Children's Trust Fund. I had never told him. When I'd gotten a job and said I worked in state-level child welfare funding, he had nodded and moved on. He genuinely did not know that the agency his foundation was courting for $400,000 was the agency where his younger daughter, the social worker, the inspector, was a senior program officer with final recommendation authority on grants over $250,000. I found this out that he didn't know 6 days before the gala. One of my colleagues mentioned that she'd taken a call from someone at Meridian that week, a board member trying to understand our timeline. She mentioned the foundation's name. I mentioned that my father co-founded it. She stared at me for a long moment. "He doesn't know you work here," she said. "Apparently not." She thought about that. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the application on my desk. I thought about the audit irregularities. I thought about a 7-year-old girl and a fish named Bubbles. I thought about the word inspector said in a crowded room to someone my father wanted to impress. "I'm going to go to his gala," I said. The lobby of the Harrington smelled like it always did. Cedar and carpet cleaner and the particular stillness of expensive hotels. I checked my coat. I smoothed my blazer. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and found my seat assignment at the check-in table, table 11. Near the back, as always. My mother found me near the bar and hugged me. She looked beautiful. She always did at these things. She actually loved them in a way I'd spent years not understanding, and now understood completely. She introduced me to 2 women from the foundation board whose names I didn't catch. And then my father appeared, and the dynamic of every room he was in shifted slightly to accommodate him. He was in his element. Charcoal suit. Silver cufflinks. That handshake he perfected over 40 years of doing this, the one that managed to be simultaneously warm and measuring. "You came," he said. "I came." "Good." He squeezed my shoulder the way you squeeze the shoulder of someone you are managing rather than loving. "There are some people I want you to meet tonight." He glanced sideways at one of his colleagues. "Show off my girls a little." I smiled. Sure, I spent the cocktail hour being introduced. His younger daughter, she works for the state. At one point I was introduced to a city alderman who asked what I did, and I said, clearly and without editorializing, "I'm a senior program officer at the Illinois Children's Trust Fund. I manage grant allocations for child welfare and family support programs statewide." The alderman's eyebrows went up with genuine interest, and we had a real conversation for about 6 minutes. My father had already moved on and didn't hear any of it. Dinner was served. I sat at table 11, next to my mother and a couple who were major donors and very kind. I ate the salmon. I watched my father at the head table across the room, animated and expansive, and I thought about what I was about to do and whether I was sure. I was sure. Dessert was cleared. The program began. The foundation's executive director gave a 10-minute overview of the year's work, the programs they'd funded, the families they'd reached, the outcomes. It was genuinely good work, some of it. I want to be clear about that. The after-school program on the South Side had real numbers behind it. The financial problems were at the leadership level, not the program level. Then my father took the stage. He was a good speaker. He always had been. He told the room about why he'd started Meridian, a story about growing up watching a neighbor family fall apart without any support, which I'd heard many times and always found slightly suspicious given who my father was at home, but which consistently moved his audiences. He talked about the work ahead, the funding they were pursuing, the future. And then he did something I hadn't expected. He called me up. "I want to take a moment," he said. And he was smiling that practiced smile at the room. "To acknowledge some of my family who are here tonight. My lovely wife, Eleanor." Applause. My mother waved gracefully. "My daughter, Diane, and her husband, Greg, who have been generous supporters of this foundation for years." More applause. Diane stood briefly, smiled, sat. "And my younger daughter." He paused. The pause was deliberate. I felt it from 30 feet away. "She works for the state, does some kind of social work, case managing, something like that." A small laugh from the table nearest the stage, a few polite smiles. "We're proud of her in our way. She's always been very dedicated to her cause." He said cause, the way some people say hobby. He looked at me across the room. "Come up here," he said. "Don't be shy." And there it was. The gesture that was not an invitation but a display. Come be seen. Come be small. Come stand next to my real accomplishments for a moment. 250 people were looking at me. My mother was looking at me. Diane was looking at her phone, which was somehow worse. I stood up. I walked toward the stage, and I did not stop at the floor in front of it, where there was a small area clearly intended for honorees to stand and wave. I walked up the stairs. I walked to the microphone. My father's smile held for approximately 2 seconds. I leaned into the mic and said, "Thank you. It's good to be here." Applause, polite, confused. My father gave a very generous introduction. I looked at him. He was still smiling, but his eyes had gone careful. "I want to make sure you all have the full picture because it seems like some details got lost." I turned back to the room. I am a senior program officer at the Illinois Children's Trust Fund, which is the Illinois state agency that administers federal and state child welfare grant funding. I hold final recommendation authority on grant applications over $250,000. I let that sit for one breath. I've held that position for 2 years. The room was very quiet. I love this work. I've spent 10 years in child welfare, first as a case manager, then as a policy analyst, now in my current role. I went into it because I believe that protecting children is not a niche cause. I said the word cause back, clearly. It is the floor beneath everything else a community builds. My father stepped forward slightly. I felt him do it rather than saw it, the way a room temperature changes. "Now, I don't want to take up too much of your evening." I smiled at the room, but I do want to mention something relevant to the Meridian Foundation's work, since this is a fundraising gala and I imagine funding is on everyone's mind tonight. Silence. The Illinois Children's Trust Fund recently received a grant application from the Meridian Foundation, $400,000 multi-year, for the Southside Family Stabilization Program. I saw a man at the head table, the foundation's executive director, go very still. That application is currently in our final review period. And I want you all to know that the program itself, the direct service work, is genuinely strong, the families it serves are real, and the outcomes data is solid. I paused. However, our financial review has identified some concerns. Audit irregularities over the past 2 fiscal years, an overhead ratio that will require substantial justification, and some governance documentation that our compliance team has flagged. These are solvable issues, but they need to be solved transparently, and the Foundation's leadership will be receiving formal written correspondence from our office next week. The room had stopped being a gala. It was something else now. My father's voice from beside me. "What are you doing?" Not a question. I looked at him. Not with anger. That's the thing I want you to understand. I wasn't angry in that moment. I was just clear. Maybe for the first time in my life in a room with him, I was simply and completely clear. "I'm telling the truth," I said. "In front of the audience you wanted to impress?" I turned back to the microphone. "Thank you for having me tonight. The work this foundation does matters. I hope the financial review leads to the corrections that will allow the program to continue receiving support. That's genuinely my hope." I stepped back from the mic. The applause was uncertain and scattered. About 30 people clapped, including the alderman from earlier, who I noticed immediately. A few others followed. Most of the room just sat in the specific stunned silence of 250 people recalibrating everything they just heard. My father grabbed my arm, lightly, as I moved to walk off stage. "You need to explain what just happened," he said quietly. His voice was controlled, but I could hear what was underneath it. "I just did. You came into my event and you introduced me as someone who does something like social work, something like that, in front of your donors." Again. I looked at his hand on my arm. He let go. "I've been doing that quietly for a long time, Dad. I thought you should know what it actually is that I do." "The grant will be handled through our standard process. The written correspondence will go out next week. If there's a formal response to the audit findings that addresses the compliance issues, the application will be reconsidered. That's how it works." I picked up my clutch from the podium side shelf, where I had left it on my way up, because I had thought about this more than once in the 6 days since I found out. The program can still get funded. It's up to the Foundation's leadership to fix the problems. I walked off the stage. My mother was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Her face was doing something complicated that I think, if I had to describe it, looked like grief and recognition arriving at the same time. "Eleanor," my father said from behind me. She looked at me for a moment, then at him, then back at me. "She's right," my mother said. "You don't even know what she does, Richard." I don't know who was more surprised, him or me. I walked through the room toward the exit, and I'm going to be honest with you, my hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the strange physical sensation of having done something you've been not doing for 30 years. Like a door swinging open so hard it hits the wall behind it. The release of it, Diane caught up with me near the coat check. That was, she started. I know. I didn't know you worked there. She sounded genuinely surprised. You never said. You never asked. She was quiet for a moment, and I think that landed because she didn't say anything else. Just stood next to me while I waited for my coat. And then she said, in a voice that was smaller than her normal voice, "Do you actually think the program is good? The South Side one?" "Yes," I said. "It's genuinely good work. Then I hope they fix it." Me too. Outside, it was that particular Chicago October cold. Not the brutal winter yet, but the air with weight to it. The smell of the lake carried inland. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute before I called my car. I thought about what my father had said up there. In our way? Proud of her, in our way. I'd spent years trying to translate that phrase, trying to find the version of it that felt like love rather than a qualifier. I don't think I found it, but I also think I'd stopped needing to. Somewhere in the last hour. The formal letter from our office went out to the Meridian Foundation 8 days later. 3 months after that, they submitted a response with corrected financials, a new auditor, and revised governance documentation. The compliance team cleared it. The grant moved forward, reduced, restructured, with monitoring conditions attached. The Southside program got funded. My father and I have not talked about the gala directly, not in the year since. We've talked about other things, Christmas logistics, my mother's knee surgery in February, a Cubs game my brother-in-law hosted in the spring. The subject of that evening exists between us. The way a piece of furniture exists in a room everyone walks around without looking at directly. But something changed. I notice it in small things. He doesn't introduce me as works for the state anymore. At Christmas, he told one of his friends that his younger daughter manages state funding for child welfare programs. Pretty significant operation. Not perfect, but a recalibration. More importantly, I stopped waiting for the recalibration. I stopped measuring myself against it. That's the thing nobody tells you about growing up in a family where you're the wrong kind of successful. You spend so long trying to get them to see you that you forget to look at yourself. You keep shrinking to fit through a door that was never actually locked. You just had to stop asking for permission to walk through it. I bought a condo in Logan Square in January. 2 bedrooms, no waterfall island, a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook, and a window over the sink that looks out at the neighbor's garden where someone grows tomatoes every summer. Diane came over in March and stood in the living room and said, "It's really nice." She meant it. I could tell. I made coffee and we sat at my table and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with our parents. She told me about a fight she'd had with Greg. I told her about a grant application I was proud of from a family resource center in Rockford. We talked about our mother's tendency to apologize for our father by explaining him, and how we'd both been doing versions of the same thing our whole lives without knowing the other one noticed. When she left, she hugged me at the door and said, "I want to come back." "Come back?" I said. I closed the door and stood in my living room and looked at my couch and my bookshelves and my $42 blazer hanging on the hook by the door, and I thought about a gala in a hotel on a cold October night and a microphone I picked up and didn't put down until I was ready, and I thought, that was the beginning of something. Not the revenge. I want to be careful with that word because what happened at the Harrington wasn't revenge exactly. It was accuracy. It was saying true things in a room where untrue things had been said about me for a very long time. The beginning of something was actually smaller than that. It was driving home that night, hands still shaking, and realizing I didn't feel the old hollow feeling. The one that used to settle in after every family event, every quiet dismissal, every "she works for the state" offered as a kind of apology to rooms of strangers. I just felt like myself. It turns out that's enough. It turns out that's the whole thing. I've thought a lot about why it took me so long. Not the gala. I understand the gala. I understand why it took 32 years of being introduced as an afterthought before I finally walked up a stage and told the truth. That part makes sense to me now. What I've been sitting with is the quieter question. Why did I keep showing up? Why did I keep driving to those holiday parties and Easter dinners and galas, handing my coat to the check-in attendant and smoothing my clearance rack blazer and telling myself that this time would feel different? I think it's because I genuinely believed for a long time that if I just did enough good work, they would eventually see it. That competence was a language my father would eventually learn to speak. That if the work got real enough, significant enough, undeniable enough, the verdict would change. What I didn't understand then, and what I understand now, in a way that sits in my chest rather than just in my head, is that the verdict was never really about the work. My father's dismissal wasn't a response to what I did. It was a response to who he needed me to be. The hierarchy required a lesser one. It required someone whose achievements he could file under quaint so that his own could remain the standard. That's not a problem you solve with a better job title. I could have been the director of the entire agency and he would have found a way to make it small. That's not cynicism. That's just what happens when someone has organized their sense of self around being the most impressive person in the room. They are not actually seeing you. They are seeing the space you occupy relative to them. And for a very long time, I let that be my mirror. The thing that changed wasn't the gala. The gala was a result. What actually changed, slowly and without fanfare, was that I started doing the work because I believed in it, not because I was building a case. I stopped collecting credentials to present to my father and started using them to do the actual thing. I took the policy role because it mattered. I spent 2 years learning grant compliance and federal funding streams because kids in Rockford and on the South Side needed someone who understood those systems from the inside. That shift from performing competence to actually practicing it is what put me in a room with real authority, not strategic authority, just real, quiet, institutional authority. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. And then my father announced it for me, in the worst possible way, in front of the wrong room. And I walked up there and corrected the record. What I want to say to anyone who recognizes this story, not the gala, but the years before it, the parking garage crying and the Easter dinners and the word inspector used as a quiet erasure, is this, the work you do when no one who matters to you is watching is still the work. It is still real. It still counts. The kid whose case you stayed late to document does not care whether your father respects your job title. The program that gets funded because you knew the compliance requirements does not care whether your sister thinks you should have bought a house sooner. The actual impact of your actual life is not diminished by the people who can't measure it. Eleanor said something to Richard that night at the bottom of the stairs. You don't even know what she does. And I've held that sentence close, not because it vindicated me, but because it reminded me that invisibility is not always what we think it is. Sometimes the people who claim to see us most clearly are the ones looking hardest in the wrong direction. I am not invisible. I never was. I was just in a room with people who needed me to be. I walked out of the Harrington that night into cold Chicago air, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because of the stage. Because of the $32 blazer and the decade of work behind it and the simple, clear fact that I knew exactly who I was, even when the introduction got it wrong. That's the only kind of power that was ever going to matter.